All right. Hello and welcome to Conversations with Non-Catholic Christians. I am thrilled and honored to be joined today for the part 2 episode. Dale from Real Seekers. What's up, Dale? Oh, you're still on mute, Dale.
Okay, let's try it again. Let me get up my energy levels.
Take it from the top.
Hey, Kevin, I'm glad to be back. But yeah, no, I'm looking forward to this to part 2. I know we covered. We were going over your video on the Shroud of Turin and why you've foolishly decided to be a Shroud Skeptic, and I've corrected you on that. But yeah, today it's going to be the completion, going over that and looking at some of your objections to the actual images rather than dating evidences and stuff. So
that's right. Last time, so I had a 2-part claim that I think that the Shroud is medieval and that it's art. You only corrected me on the medieval part. You have yet to correct me on the art part. And so that's what we're going to talk about today, right?
Yep, exactly.
Awesome. And just so that everybody in the audience knows, Dale shared his slides with me, but I promised not to look at the art section slides. And indeed, I have not looked at the art section slides. So this is going to be as new for me as it is for all of you. I was a good boy and I did not look at my Christmas presents early.
Nice. And for whatever it's worth, I haven't looked at the slides since I made them for your show last time. So it's going to be new for me too. I'm going to have to remind myself. So yeah.
Cool. We're on even footing then. Okay. Do you think that it would help if I pulled up my video and I played maybe, I don't know, 60 seconds or so of the second half of my video?
Yeah, I think it's important to play each, like what we did last time was kind of split it up for each objection. You have 2 objections on this front. So play that for the audience so they know what I'm talking about.
Perfect. I've got that pulled up. This is at the time point where I'm saying, I think that this shroud is art. Oh, and you know what? I actually pulled up the second part first. So let me just go back to this time point. And I'm going to go ahead and hit play. And I'm going to hope that everyone can hear it. And then I also need to explain why I think that this shroud is art. In short, it's because an original member of the STURP team, literally given the title the father of modern microscopy, Dr. Walter McCrone, said that the shroud was painted. Another source that I will cite to support my claim that the shroud is indeed art is Inquest on the Shroud of Turin by Joe Nickel, published, likes to point out. So I think that I just kind of fast forwarded to the pages that I'm actually quoting from. But the main point here is that Dr. Walter McCrone, an original member of the STURP team, said that he thought that there was effectively pigment in the shroud that an artist would use. That was kind of the main point. So, Dale, what do you are you convinced now it's art?
I'm not. So yeah, unfortunately, this evidence has been thoroughly debunked by STURP. I guess I'll once you stop sharing, I can go into kind of my presentation. Yeah, we're gonna have to alternate this time, I think. So, so you just press stop sharing, and then. Are you frozen? Audience, can you guys still hear me? Is the problem on my end? Well, I don't know if I'm live and Kevin is frozen, or if Kevin's frozen and Kevin's live and I've somehow been frozen, but all right. Okay, yeah, so the problem's on Kevin's end. So we're still live. Okay, so while we're waiting for Kevin, let's see if I can share my screen and keep whoever's here entertained while Kevin comes back. Oh, and because I'm not the host, I can't bring that up from the queue. All right, cool. Well, Kevin has been turned into a shroud. Absolutely. Yeah, he's totally gone. So okay, so I'll just talk at you. It's better if you have visuals, I find, but there's nothing I can do about that. So yeah, so basically, who is this Walter McCrone fellow, right? So in the first place, he also quotes another shroud skeptic, Joe Nickel. And Joe Nickel, he is a famous skeptic. He works for the Skeptical, or worked for the Skeptical Inquirer. He may still be there. But he is not an expert, right? He is really a stage magician, and his degree is in English or something. So he's not a scientist. He was really just relying on Walter McCrone's findings, and he just blindly followed whatever Walter McCrone said. Interestingly, though, Joe Nickel disagreed with Walter McCrone. He said that Walter McCrone was full of it. The shroud is not a painting at all. Instead, he argued for what's called the powder rubbing hypothesis. And Walter McCrone on his end said, no, the powder rubbing is total BS. It couldn't work. There's the inevitable problem of snow fencing, which is what Walter McCrone said. So he said Joe Nickel's hypothesis couldn't work. But it's just funny because Joe Nickel said that Walter McCrone's painting hypothesis couldn't work either. So either way, you have two shroud skeptics disproving each other here. But for the moment, let's focus on this claim from Walter McCrone. And Walter McCrone did have various pro-paint findings. He was given samples. He never studied the shroud in person himself, but he was given samples from the Stirp chemist, Dr. Ray Rogers, who was pro-shroud. He gave him about 32 samples to study using his polarized light microscope. And McCrone studied these samples for about a year. It contained body image samples, bloodstain samples, and non-image samples. And he claims to have found that the images were composed of a red ochre or an iron oxide pigment. And then later on, McCrone totally missed this, but his team, through spectral analysis, also said that some of the bloodstains were touched up by red vermilion pigment. And let me just check to see if Kevin's back yet. Okay, good. Kevin, you're hearing us and stuff?
I am. So I am so sorry. My computer literally gave me the blue screen where it was like, sorry, something went wrong. And it just restarted on me. And I have no idea why. I am so sorry. I'm going to hope it doesn't happen again.
No problem. I did a good job. I kept the audience going in the meantime and stuff. Now, one thing you could help me with is if you could, because I was trying to share. Oh, you brought it up. Okay, good.
Yes, I did. Yeah. I got back maybe 60 seconds ago, and I started sharing your screen. So we were looking at your PowerPoint just a second ago.
Cool.
So
I was giving filler, waiting for you to come back anyway. So all right, great. So we can get into this on the slides. Let me make it full screen for the peeps. And okay, so we can kind of summarize what were the findings that Walter McCrone made that made him think, yes, these images are composed of paint. And there are 4 categories of pro-paint findings. Number 1, he found iron on the shroud. Iron is an essential ingredient of an iron oxide or red ochre pigment. Secondly, he claimed to have positive tests for proteins. And proteins are important because in paint, you have to have a binder, a gelatin binder, and that usually contains proteins because it's made from animal parts. Thirdly, there were certain optical properties of the image fibers that he said, yep, he could see through his microscope that there were these paint particles covering the image samples. And fourthly, in terms of he performed certain tests for blood, and they all came back negative, saying so it couldn't be blood. And if it's not blood, what else would it be? Well, he's thinking it's this pigment, it's this paint kind of thing, right? So that's his assumption there. Now, McCrone, as I said, was not an official member of Stirp. He never studied the shroud images in person, unlike the credible Stirp scientists on the pro-shroud side who saw it with their own eyeballs and had the instruments pointed directly at the cloth. So that's a fundamental difference. And also, McCrone, with one exception, he never published his results in any secular peer-reviewed science journals. He only published it in the Microscope, which he was the editor. So that doesn't qualify as peer review. But yeah, as I said, he claims in the Microscope, which is his journal, that he found various contamination particulates from other pigment traces discovered on the shroud. So it's important to note, yeah, he also found other paint particles that he thinks have nothing to do with the images, right? So these were attributed to contamination. There was a bunch of other stuff found, modern felt tip pen mark was found on the shroud, insect legs, pink nylon, a whole bunch of paint, pigment particles that, again, McCrone said were just contamination, and everyone admits they're just contamination, and a whole bunch of stuff. There is some 36 types of identified external contamination particles on the shroud. Okay, so we have obviously Stirp, who they studied it, and they completely contradicted McCrone. And the Stirp scientists, using dozens of spectral, microchemical, chemical, and physical experiments, tested the cloth for all known organic and or inorganic pigments, paints, and dyes. And they didn't find any sufficient evidence for saying that the body images were composed of paint and or that the blood stains were composed of paint. In their own words, they explained that the body images, quote unquote, the fibers are only colored yellow-brown due to chemical reactions involving the, I can't say that word, polyacerides, composing the linen fibers. Oxidation, dehydration, and conjugation colored the linen fibers are only colored due to a chemical reaction involving the fibers themselves. There is no evidence of a coating or extraneous material added to the fibers to cause the body image color. So basically what they're saying here is that the body images, what is it that colors it, that straw yellow color? Well, it's oxidation of the cellulose fibers themselves. Just like when you put a newspaper out in the sun, over time, the radiation from the sun turns the paper yellowish. That's oxidation or dehydration of the cellulose. That's what Stirp is saying is the body image color on the shroud. In terms of the blood stains, world-renowned blood expert, Dr. Alan Adler, he summarizes their findings as well. And okay, so I have a video clip there. All right, so I'll bring that up. Hang on. But just before I go to Alan Adler, basically Stirp's results were published. Unlike McCrone, these were published in more than 24 of the world's most prestigious secular science journals. All of them available for free on Barry Schwartz's website, shroud.com. Let me just actually, am I showing the internet there?
Yeah, I see it. Yep.
Perfect. So, yeah, if you go to shroud.com, simple as that, and then you scroll down right here is everything related to Stirp, including Stirp's published papers, all for free right here. And these are not religious journals. Look, Applied Optics. These are Canadian Society of Forensic Sciences journal. These are journals that have the highest impact factors in the world. They are the top scientific secular journals that have ever existed in history. So there's quite a difference between McCrone just publishing in his own journal, The Microscope, with one possible exception, versus the Stirp team publishing their counterpaint findings in dozens and dozens of secular peer-reviewed journals. Now, I did just want to play that clip from Al Adler. All right. See, this is why you gotta, okay, and it's from the
Shroud of Turin has been hailed by some as the authentic burial cloth.
1 hour, 23-minute mark. 34. All right, close enough. All right, cool.
Were in fact not quantitatable. They're what people call surface precipitin tests. And so while it's with a stained fluorescent antibody, you can see it's a positive test. If you say, well, baboons win a factor of 10, Is it really human? He insisted it was. We're a lot more cautious than that. What I insist is we've definitely demonstrated this is a primate blood, most likely human, but we've not unequivocally established it's human. All right. What I've shown you is that we, in fact, have very good evidence. In fact, the blood is blood. We can reconcile all the things that Walter has used saying it isn't blood with, in fact, our test by simply looking a little bit deeper at controls and looking at the types of evidence that have been advanced. I showed you how with an ad hoc hypothesis, like Joe would use, that you could rule this out. But we rule that out by Occam's razor, because he needs about a dozen compounds to explain what I explained by one compound. That's the difference in the way scientific literature works. If you tried to put those 15 compounds as an explanation in this into the literature in a referee journal, it would be bounced instantly.
So that's basically the clip I wanted to show in terms of the blood. And it speaks volumes in terms of methodology, right? Like, look, the STIRP team, just by positing blood, easily accounts for all of the spectral tests, all of the chemical tests, including Walter McCrone's findings when adjusted for proper controls and proper methodology, which he didn't always use. He made some big goofs in some of his work on the Shroud. Blood explains everything. If, on the other hand, if you want to posit paint, you're going to have to posit something like 12 to 15 compounds just to explain all of the data. That's not the simplest explanation. And if you tried to publish that in the peer review, it would be bounced instantly, as Al Adler says. Guess what? That's what happened with McCrone. His results didn't get published except for in his own journal, The Microscope. Okay, so is that it? Okay, that
I can ask some questions if that was your only slide on. Ooh, and you know what? I'm gonna mute you real quick only because I was getting a I'm getting an echo and I think it's from my own side. So let me unmute you and figure out.
Okay.
Do you hear an echo from me, Dale?
I don't hear any echo at all.
Okay, that's good. I'm not sure where then that's coming from, but oh well, I'll be fine. What I could do real quick is ask you a question about the particle size of the iron oxide. So I remember being impressed by something in that microanalyst in the Shroud chapter of Joe Nichols' book. And by the way, Joe Nichols, I believe that he is a PhD investigative journalist. So he's not, you're right, he's not a scientist. He's a journalist. And his degree is actually from the University of Kentucky that I live like 10 minutes from.
Yeah, it's English or something. That's what I saw on his Wikipedia page or whatever.
I thought it was journalism.
I remember English.
Okay,
maybe, yeah.
But on page 122 of Inquest on the Shroud of Turin, it quotes from Dr. McCrone. And let me read it. And you know what I can even do is I can share my screen real quick.
Yep. I'll stop sharing.
Let me go like this. Okay. So hopefully the audience can read that. If not, I can read it. So
yeah,
I'll read it.
I can't read it, but
I wonder if I'm able to. I don't think I'm actually able to make that unless. Can I go like this and like? Let me see.
I'm curious, just so I know, Kevin, is this your only access to McCrone's work? Like, do you have McCrone's book specifically, or?
No, I don't. Is it like, can I get it through a library?
I think so. Yeah. I mean, it was published 2002, I believe. So, yeah.
Okay. I mean, I'll have to check it out.
Yeah. Just because it's the primary source. Like, as I said, you weren't here for this, but Walter McCrone and Joe Nichols disagreed with each other. They contradicted each other, right? So, I mean, McCrone totally ruled out Joe Nichols' method as scientifically impossible due to the problem of snow fencing, right? And vice versa. Joe Nichols is saying, no, the painting thing can't work, even though he's using McCrone's pro-paint findings to support his powder rubbing thing. Yeah.
And McCrone didn't think that it was... So McCrone thought that it was a powder rubbing within the past 200 years or something, right? And the reason I'm trying to remember the book, but right here, I don't know if you can read that, but right in the middle of page 122 on the left, it says, most of the ferric oxide particles were exceedingly small, generally measuring 1 micron or smaller. That is being in the submicron range. McCrone, Rogers et al. Believed that they were relatively modern in origin. That was because, Stirp thought at the time, iron oxide, Fe2O3, in submicron size was not available prior to 200 years ago. Therefore, a preliminary Stirp overview report concluded, quote, if the iron oxide was intentionally applied, it could only have been to enhance the image. Because of the perfect correlation of density with expected cloth body distance and the perfect correlation with the yellow fibers, we cannot rule out some not yet understood natural method. We can state categorically, however, that no intentionally applied pigment was part of the original image prior to possible enhancement. And so Nickel goes on to quote McCrone further on, but I guess the part that I was like impressed by was the fact that these iron oxide Fe2O3 particles were smaller than a micron. And I think that why that impressed me so much was because I used to do micronization like as a living kind of. So we micronize drugs today for the sole purpose of increasing their surface area. And when you increase something's surface area, you're increasing its bioavailability. So think about it this way. One big snowball has a lot less surface area than a bunch of smaller snowballs. Mm-hmm. And so a bunch of smaller snowballs could hit many more targets than one big snowball can. That's kind of how it is. And so if this iron oxide was, if it was micronized, I mean, that means that they were using mills that weren't available until, I guess the Enlightenment at the earliest. And I don't know, I kind of thought that was kind of interesting because it says to me something along the lines of like, yeah, hey, somebody in the 18th or 19th century, probably just a couple hundred years ago, was using iron oxide to touch up the image. And I don't know, I just kind of thought that was interesting. Do you know anything about that?
So there are, believe it or not, some pro-Shroud people. They're a minority of people. They go against Stirp's conclusions. And so Giulio Fonte, for example, right? I mentioned him. He thinks that some of the bloodstain images have been touched up with vermilion pigment, though. So not the iron oxide pigment, but vermilion. And again, yeah, he's kind of basing it somewhat on McCrone's findings and stuff like that. I prefer to go with Stirp just because that's where the majority of data is in the secular peer-reviewed literature, versus, one or two pro-Shroud guys that are kind of mavericks and stuff like that. They're not the mainstream view. So yeah, when it comes to all the variety of the tests that Stirp did, I mean, again, as to the micro particles, I'm not sure about that in terms of it being. I know that Walter McCrone definitely did not believe that the shroud was painted in the Enlightenment period. So obviously, if anyone said anything about that, it would have to be a touch-up type deal. But what I think, okay, so here's the answer, right? Because we know for a fact that there are external contaminants of paint particles all throughout the shroud that have been discovered. Everyone admits this. Walter McCrone, Stirp, we're all on the same side. And we know we have photographs. Barry Schwartz has actual photographs of paintings being put on top of the shroud images in order to sanctify. You're a Catholic, you would know why they do this, but they do this. And quite obviously, that's how contamination happens. Paint particles will flake off and accumulate on the shroud and then be discovered. So there have been lots of contamination particles. Paint was definitely found on the shroud. But where Stirp and Walter McCrone differ is that Walter McCrone has argued that no, but it's in sufficient quantities only in the body image areas that we can say, yeah, the shroud images themselves were painted. Interestingly enough, even the Shroud skeptic Hugh Ferry denies this claim by Walter McCrone, and he likes Walter McCrone's pro-paint findings, but he admits that McCrone was wrong, that they were not painted, and the images aren't covered in paint. He believes that all the paint has flaked off and worn off over the centuries and stuff like that.
Okay.
So the one thing when you mentioned the microparticles is that, look, Stirp conducted dozens of spectral tests, X-ray fluorescence, UV fluorescence, infrared. I can bring up my slides and, name what these, oh no, did I close it? Name what some of these were and what they did. None of them detected these particles of paint, only in the image areas, not in the non-image areas. That's a falsification right there. Look, maybe you can come up with an excuse to try to say why one of these spectral tests missed, didn't pick up on these, but you can't do that for 12 to 15 separate independent spectral tests, all giving a negative result. And that's not even getting into the chemical tests that L. Adler and John Heller did. When it comes to spectral instruments pointed directly at the cloth, I trust those over the eyeballs of one atheist who's just biased against the Shroud. Prove, if you've read his book, I'm not cheating by saying this guy was biased. He definitely was. Even if he was right, this guy was biased. But yeah, so I would take 12 to 15 spectral instrument tests over the eyeballs and subjective judgment of one atheist who claims to have seen differently through a PLM microscope, which even in 1978 was known as the dinosaur of microscopes. So yeah, that's
that all makes sense. Before we move on to the next section, can I ask you one more question about like McCrone and all this? So I'm looking in the book right now for the part that I'm trying. Like I remember it through memory, but I'm just not finding it in the book. But I remember something along the lines of like McCrone was suggesting. So, and correct my misremembering here, but it was something like the Stirp team reached out to McCrone prior to their getting their hands on the Shroud. However, for whatever reason, ultimately, like in 1978, when the Stirp team actually got their hands on the Shroud, McCrone was not there, whether he wasn't invited or whatever. I don't recall.
So he talks about this in his book. He even gives letters. It's very detailed in terms of the politics and so it was totally his choice. He did not want to be involved, right, in Stirp. So yeah, it was him that said no to Stirp. And Barry Schwartz speculates, just like it appears that he just wanted to make a name for himself. And I don't know if this much is true, but this is just a quote from Barry Schwartz, who again was familiar with him and the goings on at this time. And he just says, look, if Stirp did come back and they said the Shroud was a painting, McCrone would have said no, just for his take was that he was looking for the publicity. And having read the book and his letters, I do think there is some, I don't think he would have concluded it's not paint, but I definitely can see, look, he was trying to make a name for himself and be famous off doing this thing. And that was more important to him than scientific truth. And some proof of that is how he treated his own team because he missed vermilion pigment. Somehow he totally missed it. This world famous Shroud skeptic and microscopist was incompetent at his job. He didn't see any vermilion, but his team found it through a spectral instrument in one bloodstain sample 3CB. And on this basis, McCrone was absolutely livid. How you're making me look bad. How dare you find this finding? Like he was berating his own team because of this. Finally, because it was the data, he begrudgingly accepted this and he modified his theory. He went through 4 different versions. First, starting off with the Shroud was a finger painting, which was just ridiculous to suppose in the first place. But yeah, he was really angry, even at his own team, because they found something he didn't. And he stated his bias is that he was upset that the PLM microscope, the polarized light microscope, was kind of a joke in the industry. And that's his bread and butter. That's what he loved. So he kind of really wanted to single-handedly, by using the Shroud and using the PLM to discover that it was a fake, he wanted to kind of show like, hey, look, that we're still relevant today. Like you don't need this more fancy microscopes and stuff. So again, that's kind of insider details. I recommend read Walter McCrone's book. I mean, he provides the letters back and forth and you can judge for yourselves. That's just my kind of assessment there, but yeah.
No, cool. Yeah. And then and I'm still looking for it and I'm finding some stuff, but I remembered something about how McCrone, like in like 1977, was trying to get the STERP team to do radiocarbon dating. And I think they didn't want to do radiocarbon dating or something. And that kind of made McCrone like a persona non grata or something like that. Do you remember anything about that?
I do. Yeah, it's been a few years since I've read his book, but when you mention that, I do, and I think the reason why is right at that time, around 1978. That's when the the AMS carbon 14 dating method was invented by Harry Gov and those. And that meant that you didn't have to destroy as much of the cloth as you did with traditional carbon 14 dating that existed from the 50s, or whenever Libby invented it there in the 50s, I think it was. So you could just destroy a much smaller subsample. So McCrone was kind of saying like, hey, here's our opportunity. He was trying to advocate for that. And there was some hesitancy behind that. But as we know, STERP wanted to include that, and they did include that in their STERP number 2, where they proposed, after 1978, the original investigation, they proposed a total of 26 tests for a second investigation, one of which included carbon 14 dating with this AMS method, which by that point was a little bit more well established, right? Rather than this brand spanking new thing that just came out where does this even work? There's hesitancy and stuff, right? By this time, they felt it was a little bit more safer, so they wanted to include it. And but yeah, they also tested some others. There was 3 different types of carbon 14 new methods that were all competing with each other in the early 80s. So gas scintillation was one, and I forget, liquid something or other was the other one. But yeah, so basically AMS kind of won out and stuff like that. But the STERP, it wasn't like STERP was against carbon 14 dating, because again, on their initiative, it was just too new in 1978. But on their initiative, they were the ones getting it included in the second round. Yeah.
Yeah, it was like the radiocarbon dating was eventually like the fact that it did happen was because of the STERP team, despite the fact that they were initially not super keen on it, right?
Yeah, they were just, again, this was a method that was literally just invented that same year. And don't forget, with STERP, the reason they won out, McCrone tried to submit his own proposal. Other people, in order to just do these tests on the shroud, it's not like they just woke up and said, "Hey, we want to experiment on the shroud," okay, go ahead, take it out and do what you want to do. No, they had to submit a scientific proposal. McCrone submitted his own. He wanted to take all the glory for himself. It was rejected for being not rigorous enough, whereas STERP spent 16 months, and that's on the website. It's a 62-page proposal on that the shroud.com website where I showed you. You can see what their operational test plan was and how rigorous that was. That's why they were selected for the job, and McCrone was rejected, and that he didn't like that. That kind of angered him, right? So he had a bias against STERP from that moment on, kind of thing as well.
Okay, yeah. Cool. Okay. I think that I'm pretty much out of questions on here. It sounds like I need to read McCrone's book as well as read all these papers that are on the STERP website. But unless you had anything else to add about the pigments and all that, I'm happy to move on to the proportions.
Yeah. I guess just one thing I'll say is, again, if you want the actual details, I on my Real Seekers thing, I have detailed sources getting into what were the tests, what were the results. So like I have my own solo show. It's called Shroud Solo Show Part 8, where I go into everything. What was McCrone's findings and tests that he did? What were STERP's findings and tests? Where do they contradict and why? And how do we find out what the truth is and stuff like that? But yeah.
Cool. Okay. I'm going to present my screen again so I can play like 60 seconds or whatever of the next part of my video from like a year and a half ago, where I talk about proportions. So I'll play 60 or so seconds from here. Let's take a look at the Shroud of Turin, the great Gothic art fraud. Because if it's real, the brain of Jesus was the size of a proto-human, by Gregory S. Paul from 2010. This article supports my claim that the Shroud of Turin is indeed. The shroud is 4.4 meters or 14 feet long. The total height of the shroud figure cannot be directly measured from the front view because the feet are indistinct and their posture uncertain. But it is not possible for the figure to be significantly under 6 feet because the lower legs would then be overly short relative to the upper legs and to the body as a whole. Although suspiciously tall, the total height and weight of the shroud figure are not abnormal. The dimensions of the head forward a little bit just to see what
shroud
I'm
image,
talking
some obvious
about.
and others subtle. Concerning the obvious, one lower arm is much shorter by about a third than the other. This remarkable gross distortion cannot be attributed to different postures or angles of the arms in their response, which brings us to...
I think that's probably good. So my critique here was that the proportions of the shroud are not correct. One arm is shorter than the other. Jesus would have been like very tall for his day, which, although not impossible, does seem like perhaps a little weird. Things like that. So I am happy to pull up your slides, Dale, if you had slides prepared for this as well.
Oh, all right. Well, I think I'll do that.
Okay.
Yeah. All right. Remember, we're on StreamYard, so I can...
Yes, that's right. I have to remember.
That. Come on, Kevin.
One day I'll be a real streamer.
It's in the queue now, so just whatever you want to... Whenever it's raised, just let me know.
All right, you're in.
Perfect. All right, so moving on from McCrone, anatomy. So basically, Kevin brings up the age-old problem from Shroud Skeptics about the shroud is disproportionate. There are certain anatomical features that just don't jive with it covering a real corpse. And he cites an article that I was just having a debate with a Shroud Skeptic on the Great Light Studios video today, but it's this infidels.org paper by Gregory S. Paul, who's not a medical expert. They claim to be an independent paleo artist, but they do not have any formal training in medical, or in anatomical or forensic studies and stuff like that. But he claims, number one, the shroud man's head and arm are disproportionate. Again, just by mentioning his education, just remember his opinions are no better than an informed layman here. He is not a medical expert. By contrast, I wanted to have the book here to name them, but look, by contrast, I can name over 30 at this point, trained medical, anatomical, and forensic experts, about 5 to 6 of whom I've had on my show, who are both Christian and non-Christian, all of whom who have examined the Shroud Man and found him to be anatomically sound. These include the world's experts like Robert Buckland, he was the guy back in the 70s, the show Quincy, the medical guy, that was based off Robert Buckland. That's how famous and well-known this guy was in the medical community. Frederick T. Zugaby, equally well-known, even a non-religious agnostic like yourself, Kevin, back in 1900 to 1902, Yves Delage, along with Dr. Paul Vignon, presented their case to the French Academy of Sciences, proving that the Shroud Man was, in fact, anatomically sound, and the medical experts were amazed at that time. I also had Joseph Bergeron on my show, who's another medical expert, Dr. Gilbert Lavoie, Kevin McQuaid, Tom McGovern. These last guys are all people that you can see on my Real Seekers podcast, and I interview and probe these medical experts on these supposed disproportionalities specifically. None of them say that this disproves that the shroud covered a real corpse or is an artwork. Did you have a question? Or
so Zugaby, he's also a religious author, right? Like he wrote books So he's also probably like a weird pick, right? Because he seems like he strikes me as somebody who is more religious than most.
Well, he's definitely religious. If you remember when you were on my show, he's the doctor, one of the forensic experts who studied one of those Eucharistic
Right.
miracles, and he published on that, right? Although there is some discrepancy, what happened later on in his life, I would say, but nonetheless, in terms of the studying the Shroud Man, this guy is qualified. He's got I forget his title. I wanted to have the book here so I could read off their titles, but this guy has 25 years of experience, something like over 500 autopsies performed. He did experiments with corpses and stuff like that themselves on body farms to study how the Shroud Man would have gone and stuff like that. So Frederick Zugby is qualified to have this judgment, religious or not. You can study his findings and see if it's correct. But point is, he's not alone. We've got lots of other experts. I would say about 30 at least who have all studied the Shroud. By contrast, on the Shroud skeptical side, look, I kind of make fun of Gregory S. Paul and Joe Nickel. These guys aren't qualified, but there are at least 2, maybe 3 forensic experts who would side on the Shroud skeptical side. So that just shows you where the consensus of scholarship is. Now, in terms of Jesus's height, this was the first issue you mentioned. So believe it or not, the Shroud Man is about 5 feet 10 inches tall. Again, it's not a precise measurement because we don't know, has stretching of the cloth been taken into account? We can't be precise, but most experts say he's about 5'10". And this is not taking into consideration possible stretching of the cloth over time and the possible position, configuration, or draping effect of the cloth over the body at the time of image formation. So all these factors are variables that could, plus or minus an inch or 2 or something like that, that we don't know about. However, most experts have said, taking account of all these things, we can say that he was about 176 centimeters, 5'9" is probably what the best judgment as to what the Shroud Man actually was. And this is perfectly normal for a Galilean. And we've actually found archaeological proof. This actually fits the rabbinical proof of being at 4 L's, which is about 5'9". That was the average at the time of Jesus, according to secular Jewish sources. And archaeological finds of bones in Galilee prove that this was the normal average height for Jewish men in this area at the time of Jesus. So actually, Jesus is perfectly average, or at best, maybe 1 inch taller than the average of his time. Okay, and I've got a little clip to show from the 17. Oh no, that's just my source, maybe. Okay, so the next issue you said is that the face is too narrow. Now, what's the explanation for this? It's just not true. This is purely an illusion caused by the photographs themselves. What do I have here? Proof from the photographer, Barry Schwartz. This is the guy. Every color photo you're looking at of the Shroud is by Barry Schwartz. And he's showing how basically it's an optical illusion based on the photography that makes it look narrower than it really is. When you account for that, the face is fully wide, the normal width proportions, right? So once you take care of those optical distortions, and he basically says, in this version, I applied the same correction to both sides of the facial image. As you can see, the face appears more natural and complete. This is a direct result of the banding found running throughout the entire cloth and represents the different batches of yarn used to weave the cloth. In the ancient method of weaving, each batch of yarn was bleached individually, so they were all slightly different from each other, and some bands took up the image differently than the adjacent bands. When the Shroud image is contrast enhanced, which it always is in the photonegative view, the fainter areas of the image are pushed down into the black, making the face appear appear more narrow than it actually is. However, as this image demonstrates, the full facial data is actually in fact there. And Barry told me to give him credit. So this is from photos taken in 1978 in person. Barry Schwartz was the official photographer of the STRP team. So thank you to Barry for providing me with these personal photos. These are not photos that are available online. He gave me them specifically for this presentation. So thank you to him for that. Were you about to say something, Kevin? Or?
Yeah, I guess just a question. So I guess even when I'm looking at, and so is this image on the right, the same image that was the rightmost image on the last slide? Yeah, it is the same image as the rightmost one on the right side. So that area in the red that is being lightened by 15%. I guess when I look at the image on the right, if I just kind of like, I don't know, like if I want to see still essentially the image on the left, I still kind of can. Like the area that has been lightened by 15% doesn't strike me as being overwhelmingly like, yes, that is absolutely like how the image is supposed to look, quote unquote, I guess. Like I can still see the narrow face in the rightmost image. Like if I
But you don't take, because he hasn't done the effect on this side, right? So this is still suffering. But you're saying this looks perfectly normal width to me.
So like I can kind of see a full jaw if I like decide to see it that way, but I can still see that strip within the red circle area as being not at all his face. Like it still looks unnaturally narrow to me. Like, you know, I guess my point is that it doesn't seem to me like this is like the, oh, look, it's just as easy as selecting part of his face and then lightening it by 15%. Like it's still even with this, like
but certainly it's wider than it would appear if Barry had not done the manipulations. Yes. It's definitely wider, right? So the information is there. Maybe lightening it by 15% wasn't enough because this banding effect is still taking place. So he has to, if he had lightened it by 20%, then everything would be there, maybe, right? So you can't assume that it's not there, especially since we know for a fact scientifically there is information encoded that's not visible to the naked eye without enhancement. So you can't assume as a skeptic that it's not there. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I'm going to quibble about the word information just because that's what I always do with like biologists who want to talk about information inside of DNA. But regardless, what I am going to say here is that I can imagine that we could just artificially choose to lighten by 15% almost any part of the shroud. And then like we could give Jesus, for instance, poofier hair. Like if we wanted to give him a fuller head of hair, like, you know, we could lighten all the area around his hair or something like that. If we wanted to make his arms more muscular, we could lighten the you know, a long strip. And I just don't know if I understand why us choosing to lighten an area by 15% should give us confidence that like, no, look, the portions are correct if we make them correct. And I'm kind of like, well, sure. Yeah. The portions are correct if we make them correct. But you kind of see what I'm seeing there? Like what I'm saying there?
I guess. And I also don't. So I'm not, Barry is an expert in photography. Obviously that's why he was selected. So I don't know all the technicalities behind it, but it seems to me that just randomly lightening cloth would not provide us with image instead of information. Let's say image that corresponds to like a face, right? It's not like they manipulated it to make it look like a face. They just lightened that band.
Well, they did, right? I mean, they selected the area that they're lightening just around his face. Like, what if we just drew a vertical line and then we lightened everything to the right or the left, depending on where you're looking at, of the vertical line by 15%?
Well, there's still a little dark gap there I see between the hair and the cheek and stuff.
I even see the dark gap, like, you know, I can still see, like, it's still darker, even though it's lightened by 15%. It still appears darker.
But that conforms to a face. If it was just randomly lightening it, I wouldn't see any gap here. I would just see like a light thing going straight into the hair. Like it wouldn't conform to a face. Like it looks rounded to me, right?
Sure, but why did we select 15%? why? Like do you know what I'm saying? Like we're purposely drawing that, and like look, the lines aren't solid. Like especially like you can see that we're tracing around his hair. You know what I mean? And then we're tracing around the thin part of the face, and then that's the part that we're lightening by 15%. And I'm kind of like,
okay.
wow,
And
okay. Like,
I'll admit, because I'm not a photographer, Barry could probably answer these in a second. I'm not a photographer, so I don't know. But
yeah,
here's the point that I would want to make for you. If I'm trying to convince you, remember, you have the burden of proof. You're the Shroud Skeptic claiming that you know this is artwork. Because why? Because the face is too narrow. And Barry's at least proposed this, let's say, an equally probable explanation that, well, no, you just think it's too narrow because of this problem with the banding. Can you disprove that the face is not there and it's not just a problem with the banding and that the face probably is too narrow?
no, I definitely can't. I mean, I can't disprove hardly anything, you know? So like if,
So why
if
not
your
be
point
why
here,
not be agnostic? Shouldn't you be agnostic then? Is my
yes.
point. Yeah.
Yeah. And like, if you like really pushed me on this, you said like, you know, Kevin, do you really know that it's art, or are you technically agnostic and you just lean towards this being art? I would be like, yeah, well, it's the latter. You know, but I'm about that on like everything pretty much, right? I don't claim to know hardly anything really. I mean, you know, so am I talking to you or a super intelligent AI? Technically, I'm agnostic on the matter,
Oh no.
but I lean very strongly towards the fact that you, Dale, are really my friend. You're a real fleshy human being on the other side of the phone, and you're not some super intelligent AI. That I do lean very heavily in that direction.
Kevin, if I was an AI, I promise I would have had an answer to that 15% question.
Just another piece of evidence on the Dale is not AI scale. But my point here is that like yes, no, you're correct, and like if at the end of the day, what I need to say is like, well, technically I'm agnostic, but I just lean towards it being art. Like that is the more accurate way to, like I guess express my disposition.
Cool.
And I guess my whole point is that I find the very careful tracing of the area that we're going to choose to lighten by 15% to be very like ad hoc, very like just so kind of, you know, do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Like what just lighten it. I don't know. Okay. Yeah, I see what you're saying. I'll ask Barry for what it's worth. And if he gives an answer, I'll send it to you and I'll post it up on my blog for people as well. So yeah. I just don't know. I'm not a photographer, so I don't know the answer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And this actually reminds me of some stuff that sometimes we see in science papers where people want a certain result. And I'm not only talking about like somebody trying to do like in a religious context, like the Shroud of Turin. Like think about it like a pharmaceutical company really wants their drug to work. And so they might it's happened before where drug companies have been caught falsifying their data, and like they wouldn't tell you that they were falsifying their data, but maybe they were artificially lightening by 15% a very select portion. And if you ask them why, they'd just be like, just don't worry about it, we're just doing it, man, to get the results that we want. You know what I mean? And I worry that this is exactly what's happening right here, where why are we drawing a certain area and then lightening it by 15%? Why? Because we want the face to have the right proportions, right?
Let me try to persuade you at least to lean in the pro Shroud direction then, because look at the photo on the left, this straight line where this dark thing comes in. That's obviously not a natural thing. It's a very straight thing. Why on God's green earth would a medieval artist make an unnatural face very, very obviously narrow with the hair sticking out like 50 inches away from the head? Like no artist would be that stupid to draw anatomy that wrong. Like they would know enough to like, let's fill out the face a bit and get it to look, you know, like the hair fits the head, right? So
have you seen medieval art?
I have, but I've never seen anything like with the hair like going off diagonally and stuff. Like Dark Age art is a different thing, I would say, but like I don't know. If you can show me a photo where someone has like an extremely narrow face and like their hair is like almost disjointed, like it's almost on a, you know, sticking off the head kind of thing. That I've never seen medieval art do that.
So maybe what I can do real quick is just see if I can put like one piece of medieval art on the screen.
Sure.
So all I did was I looked up 14th century art. That's all I did.
Mhm.
And I found something that I feel like is going to work. And if like there's an art critic who can step in here and tell me that I'm wrong, then I'm very happy to admit where I'm wrong. But I'm going to share this right here. So I don't know anything about this piece of art other than apparently you can buy a print of it for freaking $300, which is ridiculous. It's just a print of a 14th century art piece. But so this is the first thing that came up when I Googled 14th century art. Now I haven't measured this, but take a look at Jesus's arms. They look like they go down to his knees. You know, like that doesn't look right. You know, the proportions do not look right.
Yeah.
And so, you know, okay. And if we did the math,
fits the hair.
Oh, sure, yeah, the face fits the hair. But my point is that I think that 14th century artists worked with the tools that they had available to them at the time and all that, and so their art wasn't as photorealistic as people started making art later. By and large, right? By and large, I'm sure that there's some 14th century painter who could do some photorealistic stuff. I'm sure.
Okay.
But it seems
one last counter to this, because this is a good point, right? Medieval and Dark Age is highly stylized.
Mm-hmm.
Now, regardless of that trend, you have to admit that it looks like the artist that made the shroud is not following that trend. He's trying to make a realistic image, maybe. No? Okay. Yeah.
Maybe. I think that so much of the original shroud is gone, frankly. Like when you just look, like, can we pull up a picture of the shroud that is not photo negative or anything like that? I'll do that in a second. Like,
okay.
Honestly, like you miss the fact that anything is there at all, frankly. If you just look at like in like a not super well lit room. So here's something. Let me see if I can get that. Oh, it's literally. Oh, so it's going back and forth between the photo negative and the not photo negative. It was on the Shroud's website. I want to see if I can like grab a picture of the
like how it looks just naturally to the visible eye.
Yeah. Like honestly, I've seen pictures of the shroud where it's like if you weren't looking close, you wouldn't even catch the fact that there is any image there like at all. So I think I found something that'll work.
Yeah.
While
you're bringing that up, so that's a well-known feature of the shroud images to the naked eye, right? Obviously, the black and white photos that's not how you'd see it if you go to Turin. So that's basically we're seeing the quote unquote photo negative with the naked eye, kind of thing. And there's this thing, image diffuseness. It has no definable borders, which makes it unique. No other artwork or painting in history, they all have definable borders. They don't have this image diffuseness where if you're like up close, you can't even see the image. You have to kind of stand back a certain distance that's been measured before you even see the images. But yeah, here it is. Yeah.
And like if I showed this to you and then took it away from you and I asked you what it was, you'd probably just be like, well, not you, Dale, you would know, but it's just like some random person. I don't think that they would see the image of a man on there. Like you can see it when you look for it. Like, you know, you can't see my mouse on the screen, but like, you know, obviously we're looking at a body where the head touches in the middle of the cloth and they're lying horizontally like that.
Well, the heads don't touch, right? Just so you know, there's a gap
right there. Is there a gap? Oh, you're right.
There's a water stain that makes it look like they're touching. So Matt Dillahunty and Joe Nickel are totally wrong when they say that the heads are touching, and that's, you know, it doesn't take account for the top of the head. No, there's a water stain there, but there is a gap between the dorsal where the head starts. Oh, you can't see my mouse. Anyways, but
I was trying to do the same thing.
There's a gap there.
Truthfully, I can't even really see the back of a head. Like, and I'm looking for it.
Look for the crown of thorn wounds.
I see like some blood stains. You know, I don't think that we can actually assert that it's blood, but I should probably read some of those papers that you linked.
Yeah,
but I definitely see those blood stains. I just don't. I don't know that, because isn't that his shoulders? Like the dark,
like where the top of the scorch things are, like right by his like shoulders, like his shoulders are coming down.
So that can't be the crown of thorns. That's too low to be the crown of thorns. That would be bleeding from the back of the head or something right there, wouldn't it?
Well, go up a bit, and then like the bleeding. Yeah, I wish I could point it out with my mouse, but do you see those like 4 small holes there?
The 4 small holes, like pretty much exactly in the center, and the 4
They're
holes
like in a line.
Yeah.
If you go to the center, right in the middle of those 4 holes, right? So, and then just go down like 1 centimeter, you're at the back of the man's heads, and you'll see like a blood stains. That's the crown of the thorn.
Isn't that, if that's the top of his head, isn't that too low? Because it looks like the shoulders are like right there. Like, I don't know. Like, do you see what I'm saying? Like, if the blood stains to immediately to the left of the line that you would draw straight through those vertical 4 holes is the top of Jesus's head, but then his shoulders kind of start, because I can see like the burn mark. I see the shoulders, but then I also see something kind of like goes up into a neck, and so it looks like his head would end like at my eyes instead of like going another halfway almost. You know what I mean?
Well,
Like, it almost looks like
his neck's blocked by his hair in a ponytail and covering it, right? But so this is a good question. Let me continue on with my presentation.
Yeah.
Because
Stop sharing
specific things. So all right. Just let me know when it's up.
Should be good. There you go.
Okay, cool. So the next thing you said is the body to head ratio, right? So
yes,
Kevin relies on this skeptic to argue that, quote unquote, in the shroud, the total head height ratio is an abnormal 8.3. Now, believe it or not, David Falk, the Christian Egyptologist and fellow shroud skeptic, he said it's 9 heads tall. So which is it? You shroud skeptics are kind of contradicting here, right? But according to the one you're going with, you're saying it should be 6 or 7 heads, right? His body should be 6 or 7 head heights tall, kind of thing. But here it is 8.3. So that's way too tall. And okay, so I do have a clip, 52-minute mark, 52 to 54. Okay. All right, close enough. Contact is path A, the absorption path here. If you press down the cloth to touch the nose, then when you flatten the cloth out, it's going to be wider, just like the mask of Agamemnon here, or the flattened walrus effect that you mentioned. With gas diffusions, path E for emissions, it's even wider. The effect is even grosser in terms of the lateral distortions. But we don't have that with the shroud. That's not a problem, because no pro shroud guy in the world believes that the shroud images were created naturally by direct contact. So it's not a problem here. Your point is entirely moot in the video. Okay, so next let's play the next little objection that you have. Okay, so this is on the anatomical inaccuracies.
Here, there's a third problem that I noticed, which is what I can call the artistic proportion problem. Now, if you've done any sort of classical training in art, in drawing human body, there's a key principle that you have, and manga artists know this. Okay, this is well known to manga artists. Okay, it's well known to classical artists, those who have been trained in the classical method of fine art, that the human body is between 6 and 7 heads tall, okay, including the head itself. Comic book artists will say, draw us like superheroes, like Superman, 7 sometimes, rarely 8 heads tall. Okay? And that's considered to be a really robust, stout human being, somebody who's like 7, 8 heads tall. The problem with the Shroud of Turin is that the image of the body on the shroud is 10 heads tall. Portion.
Okay, so yeah, that's him kind of laying out the objection there, right? So you're basically saying it's 8 heads tall. Let me go back. Okay, so in the first place, yeah, there's a contradiction here between the two Shroud Skeptics' claims. So we have to figure out which one is correct. Kevin, I like yours because it's a little bit more reasonable. You're saying it's 8.3 heads tall, according to your source. Now, to refute this, I don't need to go to some biased pro-Shroud guys or consult any pro-Shroud medical expert or anything like that. I'm going to go to the most knowledgeable person on the Shroud Skeptic side, Hugh Ferry, and he's going to prove that I'm right. So Hugh Ferry, when he encounters this objection, he says, quote unquote, it seems that, why is that blocking it seems
There
that,
you go.
oh, okay. It seems that these skeptics have acquired their knowledge of human proportion exclusively from comic book illustrations. When Falk says, if you've done any sort of classical training in art, in drawing the human body, there's a key principle that you have, that the human body is between 6, 7 heads tall. Hugh Ferry responds, going on, this may be well known to manga artists, as these skeptics like to emphasize, but it's certainly not known to anybody interested in drawing realistic people. The quote-unquote head rule is usually expressed as the 8 head rule, which is sometimes extended from 7.5 to 8.5 heads long. Oh, 8.3 is within 8.5. Perfect. The Shroud of Turin fits. But never as low as 6 or 7 heads, except in the case of children. Here's proof from a university art textbook giving a diagram on this. Adults, 9 heads. 9 heads. It's only children that are 7 heads for this head rule. For 3 years old, the body has to be 5 heads. If you're 1 year old, the body has to be 4 heads long. So this is just from secular art textbook that Hugh Ferry gave me, the ultimate Shroud Skeptic. So I'm not quoting biased pro-Shroud people here. So this claim is just simply false. That's my answer to this supposed anatomical inaccuracy. It's not true. Yep.
Now, the number of heads tall you are is directly proportionate to your height, right? So a person who was 8 heads tall is going to be at least 6 foot, right? They're like, because the human head doesn't vary in size by that much, correct? Is that right?
Well, I mean, as you grow up, it's more correlated to age, I would say. But obviously,
For a full-grown human.
Sorry, yeah, but I mean, yeah, like obviously different humans are different sizes, so then your head will be a different size relative to your to another person's head that's smaller.
So I don't think that's actually quite right, though, right? I think that the case is that somebody's head is going to be roughly the same size. Like my head isn't like, well, I should say the average, like I might be particularly big-headed or something like that, but the average 6 foot person, 6 foot male, I'll say, versus the average 5'9" male, I think that their heads are going to be roughly the same size, despite the fact that the 6 foot tall person is, a good number of inches taller than the 5'9" person, right? So if we are saying that Jesus is legitimately 8.3 heads tall, I think that would make him like 6'4" or something like that.
All I know is that you're saying it's 8.3 heads long, right? That's what we've measured in terms of looking at the body to head ratio. And that falls within the normal parameters for an adult in terms of depicting.
Right. The article that I quote from actually says that this is fairly similar to what Abraham Lincoln was. Like Abraham Lincoln was 8 point something, right? I believe that the article that I quote from even says like this is pretty much like, hey, look, like the guy on the shroud is roughly the same size as Abraham Lincoln, which isn't
But
impossible. It's
but
just
that's not true, because he's basing this off of false. Like, he's just not a trustworthy source then, because all the medical experts have disagreed with him, and even artists are disagreeing with his rule that for an adult you can only at most be 6 to 7 heads tall. Well, that he got his facts wrong there. So why should I trust him on his measurements and stuff like that in terms of what he's saying? No, that
it almost sounded to me like you were granting the 8.3 heads tall scenario.
That's true. Yeah, that's true. I was just granting that for the sake of argument, kind of thing.
Yeah.
Right? But
and it sounds to me like if we do grant that the Shroud Man is 8.3 heads tall, then that doesn't sound like that works with the idea that he's 5'9". Like, he might need to be 6 foot at the lowest. He might need to be 6'1" or something like that in order to be 8.3 heads tall. That's kind of the point that I was getting at there.
Okay. Yeah, like I said, I don't think that, all I know is that, this has not been, according to the medical experts who studied the Shroud, this is not, his head to body ratio works. And in terms of it violating some artistic rule, in terms of you can only have an adult with 6 to 7 heads, that's just not true. That's provably false from this diagram. So that's what I know. If you're doing your own kind of measurements and you're trying to figure out from photos of the Shroud, how many heads is this, I would just say, yeah, like, that's not a reliable way to measure. There are so many variables at play in terms of what's the condition of the cloth, what was the position of the body at the time the images were formed, what's the type of mechanism that was used, and how would that implicate how the proportions are displayed on the Shroud. So I would just say there's too many open questions on that front, but we've definitely disproven, whatever else with this, we've disproven the claim of this skeptic that, according to the head rule, the Shroud Man doesn't fit those standards. That's not true. He's within the proper ratio. As to whether that means, okay, but then that's inconsistent with your claim that the Shroud Man is 5'9". Really, he's like 6 foot something. Again, I don't know. I've never done the measurements there, but just relying on the experts who've taken into account all of the various variables to the best of their ability, they've measured the Shroud Man to be 5'10" at most, or 5'9", trying to give allowances for those aspects. Now, here's something I also want to mention, because not just relying on medical experts and stuff like that, there has been a computerized anthropometric study that's published in peer-reviewed and has proven that the Shroud Man is anatomically correct. So this was done by computers, and they studied the various ratios of the Shroud Man's body. Coincidentally, they do not say the Shroud Man was like Abraham Lincoln style or 6 foot thing. No, they're consistent with what the medical experts have said based on their own assessments of the Shroud Man in person. This anthropometric study, I'll include it in my blog, but you'll see he's perfectly compatible with the Shroud Man, with a Shepherd Jew from the 1st century living in the region of Galilee and that sort of thing. That's what this study proves. But yeah, so in terms of the right arm being too long, okay, so on this front, this is something that has to be admitted, that it appears that way, that one of the arms is too long, but this is an optical illusion. And this is where, again, it's more important to don't just judge for yourself from eyeballing photos. You can't tell that way. You have to do the proper investigation and understand all of the variables at play. And this is where I kind of got into what those variables are. I've listed them before, but look, there are the conditions of the cloth, any stretching, any burn holes. So, for example, there is a burn hole that's obstructing our view of where the elbow is precisely bent. Also, variables related to the image formation mechanisms. There are clearly image distortions or anatomical inaccuracies, such as the shroud man's left leg. That thing looks like a little chicken leg compared to the full normal, right? So this artist drew one normal right leg, but apparently he was so stupid he drew a chicken leg for the left leg. No, that's because it was covering a corpse, and there was the tent. If radiation was the mechanism, there would be a tent effect from his legs being bent in rigor mortis and one being over the other. That would create a tent effect where one of the legs was further away from the cloth at the time of image encodation. And we know that the image, whatever produced the images, only traveled 4 centimeters and no more. So that's why one of the legs is different than the other. Does that make sense for an artist to get that wrong? No, especially when he gets the other one perfect. And then what, he get bumped on the head and all of a sudden drawing a chicken? I don't think so, right? So, there's another explanation. What's the condition of the body? So some people, I'm not sure about this, but some people have posited that because the body was in rigor mortis, and if you take into account the sudarium of Oviedo, where one arm was still raised with his head against it, kind of thing, and somebody had to break that rigor mortis forcefully to get him into the shroud position, maybe he either had a dislocated shoulder already, or they dislocated his shoulder, and that created the thing of an illusion. We also have Dr. Gilbert Lavoie, who's proven that he actually written an entire article on this specific issue itself. And his thinking is that the right arm is about 3 inches longer than the left. And this is nothing more than an optical illusion. He says, quote unquote, the right forearm of the frontal negative image of the shroud is 3 inches longer than the left forearm on direct straight line measurement. This study demonstrates that in reality, the right and left forearms are the same length. The reasons that the left forearm appears shorter are because the wrist of the left arm is extended forward and the fingers are bent, following the contour of the right wrist. It is the bend of the wrist and the curling of the fingers on the left hand over the right wrist that accounts for the apparent difference in the lengths of the forearms. Thus, the visual perception of the difference in the lengths of the arms is simply an optical illusion. Again, Dr. Gilbert Lavoie, one of the most famous, brilliant medical experts from the 20th century. And again, I was lucky enough, I had him on my show going into great detail about his medical findings and stuff. So, last
couple questions, if you don't mind.
Sure. I do have a clip from Barry Schwartz, but yeah, go ahead.
It might make sense for me to ask before we do the Barry Schwartz thing. So I guess just the first one, we don't actually suspect that anybody would have to break rigor mortis when putting the shroud body into the shroud, if that is indeed Jesus, right? Because he would have been buried the same night that he was crucified, right? Like he was taken off the cross, and they were like, "We go, man! It's Passover in the morning. We got to get this body buried, right?" So we probably wouldn't expect the breaking of, rigor mortis wouldn't have set in before Jesus was buried, probably, right?
No, yes, it would. So this isn't my research. It's Teddy Pappas. I don't know if you know her, but she's actually an expert, I would say, at this point on rigor mortis, even though she doesn't have any medical education, but she has done extensive research into rigor mortis and the phases that it has. And she's proven that no, rigor mortis the initial stages of it could initiate right away. And they could continue. She estimates that Jesus was in the body before the resurrection 39 hours. We've proven through a 150-year study of rigor mortis that it can last up to 48 hours in some case, again, depending on the conditions and stuff like that. But what Teddy is saying is she does not relying on rigor mortis alone. What she thinks happened with Jesus, and I want to get the term right, cadaverastic spasm is what would have happened. And that freezes you like rigor mortis. That happens instantly. We have absolute medical proof of people, for example, clutching seaweed when they drowned to death. That instant they died, they're in this state of, it's the wrong word, cadaveristic spasm, and they're clutching seaweed. So like we've got people frozen in the moment of like trying to like punch someone who's going to stab them, and they're dead and they're still frozen, and that's that spasm. And then that can maintain into rigor mortis, whereby the body is preserved into the 3 stages of rigor mortis for, you know, days and stuff like that. So absolutely wrong. Medically speaking, there's nothing. Yes, Jesus would have either his rigor mortis would have need to be been broken to get him into that state. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Yeah. I have absolutely no expertise with rigor mortis, so I'll trust the experts on that one. And then the second one is
And sorry, Kevin.
Go ahead.
Just a bit of advertising. So Teddy, she is actually going to be publishing a paper in the BSTS newsletter this summer on this topic of rigor mortis. So you can see all of her sources, peer-reviewed sources and stuff once that's published. So yeah, just so I'm not just talking nonsense. You can check it for yourself.
Cool. Okay, and then the next question, the Gilbert Lavoie thing with the right arm and the length discrepancy in the arms being an optical illusion. How does that play in with the hypothesis with the leg? Because when I was reading these two things, it sounds to me like they both can't be right. Because if the one arm is over the other arm, then the one arm is going to be closer and the other arm is going to be further away from the actual shroud itself. And so then the one should appear like a chicken arm almost, and the other one wouldn't. So am I right there where it's like, well, here's one explanation, here's another explanation. They both can't be true at the same time, but either one of them could be true independently of the other. Is that the right way to understand that?
In theory, yes, but here's the issue is going to be like, obviously with the legs being bent, there are greater distances, right, in terms of how the legs were bent and stuff like that. Whereas with the arms, even though they're bent and curved, again, I don't know if you can see it, but it's not going to be to the extent where it's a greater distance where we would expect a chicken arm, because it's still that arm, even though it's underneath one, it's still going to be close enough to the cloth that it gets fully encoded and stuff like that, right? Again, there was that 4 centimeters whereby after that, the image encodation process terminated. But in the case of the legs, there was a much greater distance between that leg due to the bending, right? They didn't, that's one thing that Teddy mentions, is that they didn't break the rigor mortis on the legs. They left them bent as in the position when it was on the cross. So that's affecting why the legs are, why we get this chicken leg, whereas we don't get that same problem with the arm. Does that make sense?
I guess, but if we were, so the legs couldn't have been more than 4 centimeters different in height from one another, because of the tenting of the actual cloth, right? Like, as in, if the right leg, for instance, and I forget which leg is actually the shorter one, but if the right leg, for instance, was completely straight and the left leg was bent entirely, so that one knee is up here and the other knee is straight away like that, and then there was more than 4 centimeters between the straight leg and then that leg just wouldn't even show up on the shroud at all, right? So the difference between the legs can't be crazy. It can be at most like the tenting effect, like the other leg can't be more than 4 centimeters away from the shroud, right?
I think it could, at least parts of the leg could, and that's why those parts didn't get encoded. It was only really that top surface. Obviously part of it was close enough within the 4 centimeters there, right? But
that's my point, is that if the top of the leg was like, less than 4 centimeters away because it did get encoded, then that means that, like, hey, when I go like this, that's,
hold on, I can't see what you're doing, so
so sorry. Right. I can just take this off this. I see. Okay.
Yeah.
So when I go like this, my wrist is going to be 3 centimeters thick. So 2.5 centimeters is an inch. And how thick is my wrist? It's at least an inch. It's probably more like 2 inches thick, right? inch and a half. But 2.54 centimeters equals 1 inch. So my wrist is like at least 3 centimeters thick. And if that's the case, and we can't be more than 4 centimeters away without losing some, 4 centimeters, you lose 100% of the image.
Right.
But at 3, I imagine that you would lose a decent percent of it. And that's why we think that the one leg is like a chicken leg. Well, then it seems to me like one hand should look like the underneath one should look like it's a chicken hand.
But I mean, don't forget that that it's curved, the fingers are curved in, right? So if you see the way the cloth drapes over it, I don't think that it would be more than 4 centimeters away from the hand.
That's not going to help. That's hardly you can hardly see it.
There's black and white photos of the hand and stuff, right?
Yeah, maybe I should just pull up one of those.
But yeah, I don't, especially depending on how the body was positioned. Shroud man body. Images. Right, is that going to be big enough? Nope. Okay. Well, I guess it's fine.
I can try this real quick.
I have something to show.
Oh, you got it?
Well, I have the position of the body. One potential for the position, just to show an idea for people what we're talking about. I wish I could make that clear. But yeah, you see how the legs are like extremely bent, kind of thing, right? And if let's suppose, okay, this is wrong. Like one of the legs is lower down and stuff, right? So it's not within the 4 centimeters, and that's why it's not getting coated, slightly lower down. Whereas with the hands, I don't see, I mean, look, one's curved up, the other's curved down. The cloth would drape over that and be within 4 centimeters.
Well, then why, if the cloth wasn't so taut that it wasn't, like if we had like a draping effect because there was so much cloth that it was just covering, then why would we see a difference in the legs? You know what I mean? Like it seems like the cloth is either very taut and therefore not covering anything except for the highest points of the body, or it's very slack. And if it's slack, then it, but if it's slack around the hands, then I imagine it's slack around the legs as well.
Yeah, but again, it even when it's slack, it can only go so far. Again, we don't have to say that it was exactly like the way these guys have done it. Let's say one of the legs was lower down, kind of thing, right? Because this is just a speculation from I think this is Giulio Fonte's notion, right? But yeah, we could say that maybe this leg was slightly lower down, and it was without rain. Like the cloth can be droopy all at once. It's not going to be within 4 centimeters if it's stuck up over top of this tent pole of a knee, so to speak.
I mean, if the cloth was loose enough, then it absolutely would, right? Because I mean, if the cloth was so loose, it actually could be draping in between the two legs, and like we wouldn't know, right? Like the gap between the knees or something. And we just I guess we.
Well, I mean, it's not like it's like a bed sheet or something. Right?
Yeah, it seems pretty narrow to me. Like, because that's why I was agreeing earlier that it does seem like it's pretty narrow. Like when you just look at it too, unless they cut away the edges, it's pretty narrow. Like the body on the shroud, the shoulders go almost to the end of the shroud. There's not a whole lot of slack in the shroud. And because of that reason, like I would imagine that tent pole effect that you were describing would be there. But if the tent pole would be caused by the knees, then I would also imagine that it's caused by the wrists. That's my only point.
Okay. And also, there's another factor that we have to take into account here as well, right? Because there is also the fact that the cloth had to, remember the vertically mapped wrapping distortion. So like this cloth was straight when the body was, images were projected. So yeah, that can have a whole different effect based on the body and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So yeah, that positing that it was just naturally draped no, that's not the answer. There was some straightening of the cloth that took place at the moment of image encodation. Otherwise, we wouldn't have those vertically mapped wrapping distortions. So I think that's the answer is like, yeah, there are variables that it's possible and plausible to explain it if these kinds of radiation mechanisms are true that are consistent with the data we have. But it is, at the end of the day, we're speculating. We're saying if the cloth was straightened out, if this radiation mechanism was happening, if the body was positioned this way. And again, it's not total guesswork because we do have the Shroud Man to try and judge what we can about the body position and stuff like that, right? But there are still open questions. Frederick Zugby and Rob Buckland had disagreed on, certain specifics about the position of the body, such as with the feet and stuff like that. So there are, that's my best answer. So I hope it's, again, I know it's your objection. I would just try to say, like, remember, you're a Shroud skeptic. You have the burden of proof here. You're claiming to know that the Shroud is an artwork because there are these features and stuff. But try to assess that. Look, why on earth would an artist draw a chicken leg in the first place? Like, that doesn't make sense to me. That's not even medieval stylized art. Doesn't it make more sense that it's covering some kind of three-dimensional thing? So like it, yeah.
Yeah, no. Hey, let me just kind of, and if we're winding down, maybe we're not. I'm looking at your slide deck, but a point of agreement here is like, yeah, when it comes to kind of like one-off things like this, like we don't have a million different shrouds of Turin in which we can test them all and then like kind of come to some kind of like, we can't make a hypothesis and then test them on all these different shrouds of Turin. So you're right. There is going to, like, whenever we have a singular thing like this, we're going to wind up with conjecture. It's just we have to, because we don't have any other choice. We're going to have to conjecture some stuff. And the way that I see it kind of is like, I look at the evidence that we have and it just seems more likely to me that, that it's art, and that's not to say that there is no evidence at all that supports the fact that it's not art. It's just to me, it seems like it's more likely that it's art than it is that there was a god who was killed 2,000 years ago, but then when he came back to life, his radiation, imprinted an image. You know what I mean? Like it's just kind of like a. I guess I just kind of look at the evidence. I see evidence on both sides, but I think that I think that one favors the other, and I think that you do the same thing too, where you say like, no, I'm looking at this, like hey, the evidence that's on the table. We're looking at all of the evidence. Dale knows more about this stuff than I do, though. But and then we kind of just come to the best conclusions that we can based on the evidence that we have, right? And I think, and I can't really get mad at people who come to a different conclusion than I do, as long as we're all kind of like looking at the same evidence, I guess.
Gotcha. Okay. It's fair enough. Again, I do wish to have been a little bit more convincing on the. So look, I think that we just have to admit, though, that there are apparent anatomical inaccuracies. Even Stirp admitted this in their study, but we do have equally probable, if not more probable, explanations relative to artwork, in my judgment. And look, I'm not a medical expert. I'm doing my best to present the findings that they've presented to me as a layman kind of thing who doesn't understand the technical, tibiofemoral index. Okay, cool. That's accurate apparently. So great. But yeah, so all I would ask is like, check out the sources and investigate for yourself, especially on this medical stuff, which is kind of a weakness of mine. I have not looked, like I'm not a medical expert and it's not my area of specialization and stuff like that. Whereas someone like Teddy, who's writing her, who knows what it is, 1,000-page book now or 2-volume book, specifically looking at the anatomy questions and has consulted the medical experts and that sort of thing. So like, yeah, just make sure you're looking at the best before you decide and, evaluate that artistic hypothesis I just find it doesn't make sense. It doesn't explain all of the physical and chemical features, which we haven't discussed at all in this series in part 1 or part 2. And secondly, it doesn't account for even the anatomical supposed inaccuracies. Like that chicken leg just doesn't make sense to me. Why would an artist paint a chicken leg? I can't get on board with that. That's an absolute falsification to my mind, regardless of any other issues that we can ask about how the images were formed on a body. It couldn't have been a painted work. The artist could not have gotten one leg perfect and then said, oh, I'm just going to do a chicken leg for this one. But yeah, that's my presentation, I guess. So yeah.
Awesome. Well, Dale, I'm going to have to run and feed my cats in a minute, but here at the end of our little 2-part discussion, I just want to say thank you so much for coming on the show. I do my best here to pull in like the relevant experts wherever I can. Generally, the relevant experts that I'm talking to are experts in Catholicism. So I feel like particularly honored to have you on as like the Shroud expert, and I know that you literally just called yourself a layman, but I just want to say that like at least you are the I don't even know like the right way to describe you. Because you're not just a layman, right? You're the layman who knows all of every single paper that's been published about the Shroud. You know it. You've spoken to the guy who wrote it, and so it's just it's been an honor to have you on, and it was overdue.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, like I said, we've been fans of each other's podcasts, so I wanted to come on and stuff like that and answer your questions. I really want you. I really think that the Shroud is good evidence. So if I can persuade you, I'm going to try my best to do that, of the truth and stuff. So yeah,
awesome.
Been an honor and fun.
All right, man. Well, hey, thanks again for coming on. I am Kevin. Dale has been Dale. This has been Conversations with Non-Catholic Christians. And until next time.